She never expected her life to shift in a matter of seconds. One moment, she was just another logistics officer walking through the armory with a clipboard and a badge. The next, a silent colonel stood frozen, eyes locked on the small metallic emblem she wore, a badge that whispered of a past too powerful to ignore. What followed wasn't just a change in duty. It was a revelation, one that cracked open a hidden history and reshaped everything around her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Alara Wynne didn't look like the kind of woman who made commanding officers uneasy. She was quiet, neat, dependable to a fault, and worked in the unglamorous side of military life, logistics and system supply. Her mornings began with an oatmeal packet, a protein shake, and a quick run before dawn across the red dust perimeter of Fort Merriton, a remote installation nestled deep in the Colorado mountains. Her uniform was always crisp, her hair neatly tucked beneath her cap, her tone steady and composed. To those who passed her in the halls or at the quartermaster's desk, she was simply Wynne, efficient, invisible, and predictable. If anything stood out about her, it was her remarkable ability to disappear into function. And maybe that was by design. Alara had been stationed at Fort Merriton for just under 4 months, assigned to oversee weapons inventory, troop supply readiness, and the coordination of support shipments to other installations. It was work that required precision, but rarely offered recognition. The armory was her main terrain, rows of secured lockers, scanning stations, spreadsheets full of part numbers and requisition codes. She had memorized the model names and serial variations of everything from M4 rifles to non-lethal riot gear. She was also trusted enough to conduct weekly cross-checks of classified storage units, a task reserved for only a few high-clearance officers. But even with that, she remained largely unnoticed. That was her goal. And it had worked, until the day she walked into the western wing of the armory and crossed paths with Colonel Abram Darrow. The colonel was a relic in every sense of the word. His square jaw and silver-streaked crew cut had the sharpness of a bygone era, and his command style matched. No nonsense, no softness. His presence could silence a room before he even stepped inside it. Alara had only seen him from a distance before, usually during inspection runs or quarterly briefings, where he barely acknowledged the logistics division. He wasn't known for interaction beyond high-level officers, and he certainly didn't dabble in the affairs of supply managers. But that day, something changed. Alara was doing a routine audit, inputting data into her handheld scanner when she heard the heavy tread of boots echo through the concrete hall. She looked up briefly to see the colonel enter the secure bay, flanked by 2 junior officers. He seemed mid-conversation, his deep voice bouncing off the steel lockers and walls. Alara didn't intend to interrupt, so she stepped to the side and continued scanning the rack of helmets she'd been documenting. It was at that moment he turned and saw her. More precisely, saw the badge clipped to her chest. He stopped walking. The 2 officers behind him nearly bumped into his back as he stood still, his words cut short, like someone had flipped a switch. Alara glanced up, puzzled, and instinctively looked down to see if something had spilled or been out of regulation. But her uniform was in order. The only thing different that day was the small metal badge pinned below her nameplate, an old commemorative emblem, barely the size of a silver dollar, featuring the sigil of Task Force Eden, a covert unit so buried in Black Ops lore that even its acronym was classified in most circles. She had never worn it openly before. It wasn't standard issue. Technically, it wasn't supposed to exist. The colonel's face changed, and the cold discipline he wore like a second skin faltered. His eyes locked onto the badge, not with curiosity, but with recognition, sharp, immediate, and heavy with memory. He dismissed the 2 officers beside him with a clipped wave. They hesitated, confused by the break in formality, but obeyed. The room grew quiet. Alara could feel the silence press against her ribcage like a hand. She stood straighter, not out of protocol but instinct, her muscles tightening into readiness. It was the kind of stillness she hadn't felt in years. That badge was a piece of her history she thought she'd buried deep under layers of redacted files and invisible deployments. She had been told that no one at Fort Merriton would know, that her past assignments were compartmentalized beyond top secret, sealed in databases even generals couldn't open. So why was this colonel, who until this moment didn't know her name, looking at her like she'd just risen from the dead? He didn't speak at first, just stood there, studying her, like someone processing a ghost. When he finally did open his mouth, his voice wasn't commanding, it was cautious. "Where did you get that?" he asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Alara responded with the standard line, the one drilled into her by the intelligence office she'd once answered to. It was authorized under Joint Directive Echo 7. Clearance Omega 4. That was the moment the power shifted. Not visibly, not with noise, but deep beneath the surface, like tectonic plates grinding in slow motion. The colonel swallowed hard. He gave a single nod, the kind that wasn't acknowledgement but surrender. Then, without another word, he turned and left the armory. And just like that, everything changed. What Alara didn't know yet was that this silent reaction was the beginning of a chain reaction. Secrets buried for over a decade were about to rise. The rules of Fort Merriton would bend, the lines between past and present would blur, and the woman who had mastered invisibility would become the center of a story no one was ready to hear. Before Fort Merriton, Captain Alara Wynne lived in the gray shadows of temporary quarters and classified deployments. She had grown used to being the unknown figure at the end of a long hallway, the name on a manifest that no one dared to ask about. She was 34, with sharp hazel eyes and a stillness in her expression that made people instinctively lower their voices around her. She didn't exude command in the traditional sense. There were no barking orders or chest-thumping confidence. Instead, there was precision, discipline, a quiet efficiency that came from knowing how fragile the line between chaos and control really was. She didn't speak much about her past, and no one at Fort Merriton bothered to ask. In an environment built on rank, routine, and regulation, people were content to make assumptions. Some assumed she was a transfer from a coastal base. Others believed she'd spent most of her service in supply chain divisions overseas. She never corrected them. She preferred the mask of ordinariness. After all, she had worn it long enough to make it fit like a second skin. Her quarters reflected her personality, minimalist, meticulous, and muted. One regulation bed tucked into the corner, a desk free of clutter, a locker with perfectly aligned uniforms. On the wall hung a framed black and white photo of a mountain range, not labeled, not famous, just something she'd taken herself during a silent morning patrol in Kyrgyzstan. The only other personal item in the room was a worn, leather-bound journal that remained locked in her footlocker. No one had ever seen her write in it, and she never explained what was inside. It was just there, like the rest of her, undisturbed and closed. Alara had enlisted right after college, but her education had already been quietly funded through a scholarship with vague sponsors and cryptic strings attached. By the time she finished her degree in systems engineering, she was already being recruited into specialized training programs most officers never heard of. Language immersion, psychological profiling, advanced tactical analysis, weapon systems beyond standard infantry gear, it all became part of a path she didn't choose so much as agree to follow. Her superiors referred to it as tiered integration, a sanitized phrase for grooming operatives into layers of strategic silence. Alara had never fired a shot in public, but there were 8 operations she was involved in where her signature was nowhere to be found, just results. It was in those years that she stopped looking at mirrors the same way. There was a moment during an op in Morocco, deep inside a warehouse-turned-staging zone, when she realized she didn't recognize her own voice on a comms line. That frightened her, not because of what it meant, but because of how natural it felt. By the time she turned 30, she'd spent nearly 6 years in assignment cycles that didn't appear on any formal resume. Her rank progressed steadily, but quietly. The promotions came not with ceremony, but with courier envelopes and encrypted logins. She had been given the badge, the one that now clung to her chest at Fort Merriton, not as a reward, but as an insurance policy. A small, hard-to-trace emblem tied to an operation called lattice drift. The operation had been labeled successful, but classified indefinitely. Everyone involved had either been reassigned, retired, or disappeared into private security consulting. Ilara chose reassignment, requesting a return to standard military channels. She wanted to live somewhere people stood in line for coffee and complained about laundry days. She wanted normal, not because she didn't belong in the field, but because she wasn't sure who she had become out there. Her request was granted, and after a brief stint in a base in Nevada, she was placed at Fort Merriton, a fortress nestled in silence and routine. It was perfect. Her role in logistics allowed her to work alone most days, managing supply chains and ensuring every piece of gear moved through the right channels. She studied patterns, flagged irregularities, updated systems, and trained recruits on best practices. Most officers barely noticed her presence. She wore her uniform with the decorum of someone who wanted to blend in, and she had been doing so flawlessly until she wore the badge. She hadn't planned to wear it that day. It had been tucked in a side pouch of her field bag, something she occasionally kept near her when she ran backup audits on certain categories of storage, just in case. There had been a glitch in the authentication system that morning, and without thinking, she clipped it onto her chest to bypass the scanner during access. It wasn't a conscious choice, not an act of rebellion or pride. It was muscle memory, a habit rooted in urgency, a simple decision made in a moment that would cascade into something far greater than she realized. That tiny badge, no larger than a silver coin, had once granted her access to rooms buried under mountains and decisions weighted with international consequence. It wasn't meant for visibility, and yet, here she was, standing in the middle of a weapons bay at Fort Merriton, with Colonel Darrow's gaze stuck to her like frostbite. What disturbed her wasn't the recognition, it was his reaction. That man had seen combat in Fallujah, negotiated peace talks in Central Asia, and commanded Black Flag regiments. He didn't flinch. But today he had. Not out of fear, not even surprise. It was something else, something heavier. After he walked away, Ilara didn't chase him. She stood there for several seconds, holding her scanner, pulse steady, face unreadable, but deep inside, something shifted. She had spent years building a new version of herself, far from the echoes of encrypted meetings and emergency extractions. She thought she had folded that chapter closed, but now, as the memory of his stare followed her down the hallways of the Armory, she knew better. The past wasn't just a ghost, it was a ticking signal, and someone had just heard it. Fort Merriton wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon. It wasn't listed on tourist maps, wasn't mentioned in casual conversations among military families, and it didn't show up with any clarity on satellite images. Nestled deep in the western edge of the Colorado Front Range, it was built into a natural bowl of terrain surrounded by sloping evergreens and jagged rock cliffs, making it almost imperceptible from the sky. Its perimeter spanned 37 acres, but most of its operational depth stretched underground, layered concrete caverns, and reinforced tunnels originally designed for nuclear contingency housing during the Cold War. Over the decades, the surface-level structures had been modernized into traditional military quarters, but below, the old architecture still echoed with ghost-like silence and chilled steel corridors. At first glance, it looked like any other remote base: standard barracks, motor pools, a mess hall with rotating meal cycles, a medical facility, and rows of administrative offices built from the same beige prefab materials seen across the country. But Fort Merriton operated under a different rhythm. It wasn't just a post for standard training or troop cycling, it was a node. A distribution hub for classified materials, a test bed for experimental logistics tech, and occasionally, a holding ground for individuals or intelligence assets that needed to be stored, observed, or forgotten. It was a station where routines ran deep and secrets deeper. The people stationed there weren't all aware of the full scope. Most were junior officers doing rotation duty, maintenance crews with clearance just high enough to do their jobs, and senior personnel who had mastered the art of not asking questions. Everyone had a job, everyone stayed in their lane. The motto unofficially passed around was simple: move the boxes, follow the codes, don't ask who sent them. It wasn't written anywhere, but the silence between the walls reinforced it. The Armory, Ilara's domain, was one of the most active buildings on the base. Located in the western wing, it was a 3-story structure above ground and 2 levels below. The upper levels stored the day-to-day gear: helmets, tactical vests, service rifles, cleaning kits, standard sidearms, and field communication gear. Everything was scanned in, tracked digitally, and manually double-checked once a week. Ilara's office was tucked in the southeast corner of the ground floor, a glass-paneled room lined with monitors, spreadsheets, and a floor-to-ceiling magnetic board covered in movable tags for tracking gear deployment. Below ground was different. The lower 2 levels were accessible only with tiered clearance and biometric scans. There, experimental gear and restricted weaponry were stored. Some items had no labels, only serial codes that didn't match anything in the Department of Defense's public-facing catalog. A select few officers rotated monthly through clearance zones to check for discrepancies, with Ilara leading the compliance logs. She didn't ask what some of the tech was for: drones that resembled aquatic creatures, polymer armor too light to be standard issue, tranquilizers with foreign lab markings. She just recorded their movement, made sure nothing went missing, and flagged anomalies to the base's internal review team, who never responded unless absolutely necessary. Beyond the Armory, the base had a strange rhythm. Morning bugle calls followed standard military time, but there was no real ceremony to anything. Briefings happened in hushed groups. Training exercises occurred off-grid in surrounding woods marked with barely visible sensors. The mess hall was functional, not communal. There was no laughter over meals, no fraternization that went beyond what was politely required. Everyone was polite, professional, and distant. It wasn't hostility. It was a shared understanding that this place required a kind of cognitive detachment. No one ever said it aloud, but every corner of Fort Merriton seemed to echo a silent warning: you are not here to belong, you are here to fulfill a function. The weather contributed to the atmosphere. Winters were harsh and dry, wind tearing through the pine-lined ravines with a howl that resembled the groaning of a ship's hull. Summers were strangely oppressive, hot during the day but bone-chilling at night. Storms rolled over the ridges unpredictably, scattering lightning across the peaks and briefly illuminating the vast isolation. Fog often crept down the valley during early mornings, blanketing the entire base in white stillness for hours. On those days, people moved slower, talked less, and watched their footing. Security was ever present but subtle. There were no guards pacing back and forth like in movies. Instead, cameras blinked from tree branches. Drones buzzed occasionally in the distance. And the inner perimeter of the base had motion sensors that registered anything heavier than a rabbit. Everyone wore ID badges with embedded NFC chips, and movement patterns were logged every 12 hours. Ilara once tested the system by looping a path back and forth between her office and a storage closet, just to see how quickly it flagged irregular activity. It took 17 minutes. A low-priority alert had been triggered. That told her all she needed to know. Outside the official compound, the surrounding landscape was dense and unforgiving. There were old ranger trails, long abandoned, that wound through the hills in confusing loops. Some of the older personnel talked about hearing voices in the trees during night watch, though no one ever filed reports. Fort Merriton had a reputation that preceded itself. Some even claimed it wasn't its real name. Rumors swirled that it had changed designations 3 times in 40 years, each time following a different incident the public never heard about. The only thing that stayed consistent was its use, as a place where people and things went to disappear. For Ilara, this was exactly why she'd chosen it. Remote, quiet, high clearance but low profile. A place that didn't ask questions as long as you didn't give it reasons to. She thought she could serve her term here and fade into something resembling civilian life after. She could decompress without drawing attention, retire with a clean record, and leave the ghosts buried in sealed archives. She could be useful without being seen. But now the silence was starting to break. Colonel Abram Darrow had been the commanding officer of Fort Merriton for nearly 6 years, and in that time, no one had ever seen him hesitate. His command was built on 2 things: his reputation and his silence. He wasn't the type to issue threats. He didn't need to. His presence alone was its own kind of authority. He was the product of 3 decades of institutional power, molded by campaigns across 4 continents, classified advisory roles under 2 presidents, and a stint as special envoy to a weapons disarmament council so buried in red tape most officers didn't even know it existed. He was known for getting things done, not by charm or collaboration, but by clarity and control. When he arrived at Fort Merriton, the base was a crumbling relic on the verge of being decommissioned. Within 18 months, he had reorganized it into a silent machine. Departments that had once overlapped and fumbled now moved like clockwork under his watch. Supply chains became airtight. Clearance procedures were standardized to the point of paranoia. Personnel who asked too many questions were reassigned or buried in administrative redundancy until they stopped resisting. He demanded competence, rewarded obedience, and punished unpredictability with surgical precision. And while he rarely raised his voice, there were layers beneath his cold exterior that people sensed but never dared explore. Those who had known him before his Fort Merriton assignment described a different man. Not softer, just less haunted. Somewhere between his last deployment in Central Asia and his second-to-last classified command in the Arctic zone, something had hardened permanently. His file was nearly spotless, save for one incident sealed behind Joint Force clearance levels, an op labeled Reclamation Echo. No one at Merriton knew what it entailed. But since that day, Darrow had changed. The one constant was his obsession with control. He treated disruption like contamination. Anything that deviated from pattern had to be isolated, assessed, and neutralized if necessary. He believed in containment of threats, information, emotion, everything. That was why he loathed anomalies, especially ones he didn't initiate. And Ilara Wynne had just become one. After seeing her badge and walking out of the armory that day, Darrow didn't return to his office immediately. Instead, he went to a private room in Sublevel B, a secure debriefing suite where encrypted communications could be transmitted without triggering the base's standard data logs. No one else had access to it, not even his executive officer. It was where he reviewed deep-level threat assessments, unsanctioned personnel movements, and the occasional ghost file that bypassed Department of Defense protocols. He pulled up the override terminal, typed in a string of codes only known to Tier 9 clearance holders, and waited as the system unlocked a dormant archive buried beneath multiple layers of dead encryption. He typed her name, Wynne, Ilara J. The results didn't come back with a standard personnel file. Instead, it triggered a warning: restricted access, authorized eyes only. Violation triggers immediate review. Proceed? He entered his credentials again. The screen flickered. A timestamp appeared. Her last confirmed activity under the Task Force Eden Division was 11 years ago. No follow-up assignment. No official discharge. No death notice. Just a blank gray field beneath the word, active, status unknown. It was a ghost classification. He had only seen it once before, during the aftermath of Reclamation Echo. Darrow leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. He remembered the badge now. Not because he had seen it often, but because he had been told never to engage with anyone who wore it, unless directly ordered by strategic command. It wasn't a symbol of rank. It was a symbol of exception. Those who wore it were part of something that existed beyond rank, beyond branch, an initiative built to be untraceable. Their operations designed to influence global power structures without leaving fingerprints. The fact that one of them was here, on his base, masquerading as a supply officer, shattered every boundary of his carefully maintained hierarchy. He paced for an hour after that, no calls, no orders, just internal calculations. Because the truth was, Darrow hated the idea that something existed outside his control, especially something this close. Elara Wynn hadn't requested a meeting. She hadn't flaunted her history. She had been efficient, compliant, and quiet. That made her more dangerous. The people who craved attention could be managed, but the ones who understood how to move through systems without detection, those were the ones he feared. By the time he returned to his office, the wheels of containment were already spinning. He summoned his head of internal security, Lieutenant Craven, a lean man with a background in surveillance strategy and a history of covert loyalty. Craven didn't ask questions, only followed orders with unnerving precision. Darrow instructed him to initiate a deep behavioral audit on Captain Wynn, pull her entrance logs, review her interaction patterns, scrub through surveillance footage of the Armory and mess hall for the last 90 days, flag any external communications or anomalies in her schedule, and above all, do not let her know she was being watched. But Darrow didn't stop there. He contacted a retired liaison in Washington, General Vance Mercer, a man whose name hadn't been spoken aloud in over 7 years. The encrypted line rang 6 times before connecting. The conversation was short. Darrow didn't explain the details, only said 3 words. "She's surfaced. Win." There was a pause. Then the line went dead. That response told Darrow everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a former operative slipping into retirement. This was a ghost stepping into the light, possibly without permission. And if that was the case, then something much larger was in motion, something he hadn't authorized, and that terrified him more than any battlefield he'd ever walked. From that moment on, Elara Wynn became a variable that could not be ignored, not because of what she might do, but because of what her presence might awaken. Fort Carrion had operated in stillness for too long, and now the water had rippled. Darrow would watch her. He would study every move. And if necessary, he would remove her. Not out of cruelty, not even out of revenge, but because he believed in the sanctity of silence, and Elara Wynn had just broken it. The following morning, the early light bled through the mist that hung low over Fort Brackenridge, tinting the barracks and armory in a pale silver hue. Arden was already up before the bugle. She sat at her bunk, lacing up her boots with mechanical precision, every knot and pull tighter than the last. Her thoughts were a whirlpool. Yesterday's interaction with Colonel Raleigh had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. The way his face had shifted, the way his words dried up when he glanced at her badge. Something was off. She hadn't imagined it. And though she tried to reason it away, chalk it up to fatigue or protocol, her instincts, honed by years of service and a life that taught her to survive on gut feeling, said otherwise. Down at the mess hall, the usual banter and loud clatter of breakfast trays failed to reach her. She ate quietly, quickly, and left before any of her squad could pull her into conversation. She didn't want to talk. Not about the badge, not about Raleigh. Not about how her heart felt heavier since arriving at the base. As if something here recognized her, and she couldn't recognize it back. She headed straight to the logistics hub, even though she wasn't scheduled to check in until noon. Lieutenant Bray, the gruff supply officer with a permanent scowl, raised an eyebrow when he saw her. She told him she wanted to get a head start on sorting the newly arrived equipment manifests. It was a flimsy excuse, but he grunted and waved her in. As she rifled through the files and digital logs, her eyes skimmed names, numbers, destinations, trying to find something. She didn't know what she was looking for, but her fingers stopped when she saw it. Shipment 33A, rerouted directly from the Pentagon, marked Priority Command Eyes Only. Destination Fort Brackenridge. Recipient Colonel D. Raleigh. The contents were listed as, quote, classified equipment prototype. Arden narrowed her eyes. That wasn't standard language, especially not in supply logs. She flagged it mentally, though she knew better than to pry further through the digital interface. If it was restricted, digging deeper would trigger a trace. Instead, she logged off and copied the shipment number into her notebook. She needed to talk to someone outside the chain of command. Someone who could look into things without setting off alarms. There was only one person she trusted with that kind of discretion, Corporal Lizette Hahn, her closest friend since their boot days in Fort Pulaski. Hahn had transferred to cyber intelligence last year and was now stationed in the secure tech wing just across the base. Arden found her in the data hub, hunched over monitors filled with green code on black screens. When Hahn looked up, her tired eyes softened into something close to relief. They hadn't seen each other since Arden arrived, and though Hahn greeted her with a smirk, it faded quickly when Arden leaned in and whispered the shipment number. Hahn stiffened. She turned off the monitor and guided Arden into a quieter corner, shielded by soundproof panels and low lighting. Arden explained everything, her father's badge, the colonel's reaction, the strange file. Hahn listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Arden finished, Hahn exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against her thigh. She didn't promise answers, but she said she'd look. Said she'd have to tread carefully. Clearance around that kind of shipment meant something big, bigger than Arden's rank, and possibly bigger than Raleigh himself. They parted with a tight nod, an understanding sealed in silence. Back in the field later that day, Arden joined a routine munitions training exercise. The thunder of distant practice rounds and the controlled chaos of drills helped her stay grounded. For a moment, it felt normal. Her hands remembered the rhythm of instruction, guiding younger recruits through reloads and inspections. But in the periphery of her focus, she caught glimpses, officers glancing her way, whispers that died when she approached, a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. Word was getting around. Not about the badge, not openly, but about her. About how the colonel had stopped talking mid-sentence. About how she had suddenly been seen speaking with personnel in areas above her pay grade. She knew the military well enough to understand how rumors spread like oil on water. The more she tried to blend in, the more she stood out. That night, Hahn messaged her on the secure line. No words, just a time and a location. Arden met her in the basement level of the comms tower, a space normally used for storing old network equipment. Hahn had pulled records, carefully, through shadow channels that wouldn't leave traces tied to her name. What she found made her face pale. Shipment 33A wasn't a weapons crate or new tech, it was a case file, and it was linked directly to something called Project Reverent, classified under military psychological operations and deep cover identifications. Inside the file were redacted personnel reports, fingerprints, even old surveillance photos, and one of them was of Arden, not from recent deployments, from childhood. Dated over 15 years ago, wearing a striped shirt and standing next to a man whose face had been blurred out. The tag beneath the photo read, Subject 17, Encrypted Identity Variant / Pending Clearance. Arden's breath caught. She asked Hahn what it meant, but Hahn just shook her head. She didn't know. All she knew was that this wasn't about supply chains or badges. This was about identity. About history rewritten. Arden leaned against the cold wall, heart thudding. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her name, was now in question. And at the center of it all stood Colonel Raleigh, the man who went silent the moment he saw her badge. The man who now, undoubtedly, was keeping secrets that connected directly to who she really was. Or who someone wanted her to believe she was. The snow had begun to fall with more intent that morning, laying a fine, silent powder over Fort Rexton's outer perimeter. Evelyn was already up before dawn, her boots laced, her fleece jacket zipped up to her chin, and her hair pulled back tight beneath her beanie. She'd spent the previous evening drafting an incident report after discovering more inconsistencies within the transport manifest logs. dates that didn't match movement orders, units marked for delivery that had already been signed off elsewhere. The deeper she went, the more deliberate it all felt, as though the errors weren't accidental but embedded. She had her suspicions now, and though her chest was heavy with apprehension, something steadier was forming underneath, the spark of duty, of resolve. She would never say it aloud, but she knew this much. This wasn't just about weapons. There was something systemic here, and it reeked of cover-up. That day, she was scheduled to shadow Colonel Stratham during a scheduled inspection of Storage Zone C, an area notoriously restricted and rarely accessed, except for scheduled quarterly audits. As she crossed the threshold into the outer gate area, her badge again pinged the system, and the tech sergeant at the terminal gave her an odd glance before quickly averting his eyes and waving her through. That subtle exchange wasn't lost on her. People were beginning to notice her, not for rank, but for what she was getting close to. The colonel was already at the site when she arrived, his gloved hands tucked behind his back as he stood with an air of quiet detachment. Behind him were two soldiers from base security, arms folded, no insignia on their gear. That was new. Evelyn joined them without speaking, and the colonel merely nodded and continued speaking into his comms, directing the door tech to open the steel blast doors leading into the lower vault. Evelyn had never been this far into the restricted zones, and even with clearance, she knew she was here because Stratham wanted her to be. It was a subtle challenge, a test of will, of presence. The first chamber was dimly lit and sterile, more lab than storage. On the walls were surveillance screens, databanks, and several locked containers that looked nothing like conventional weapons crates. Instead, they were marked with biometric seals and Department of Defense black site ciphers. Evelyn didn't ask what was in them. She already knew she wouldn't get a straight answer. What she did instead was observe. One of the security personnel keyed into a terminal, and she noticed a subtle shift in the colonel's posture when her badge was scanned again as part of the multi-authentication process. He didn't speak, but his jaw clenched. Just barely, she had hit a nerve. In the silence that followed, she heard her own breathing, tight and controlled, as her eyes swept the room. There were logs on the screen, entry data, timestamps, movement authorizations, but all encrypted. Stratham turned to her finally and offered a single, rehearsed sentence about the Armory's strategic purpose and how everything inside complied with regulation. Evelyn nodded politely. But this wasn't a tour. It was a warning. She was being shown just enough to rattle her, to intimidate without crossing a line. But what the colonel didn't realize was that fear no longer had the same grip on her. Not after everything she'd seen. Not after what she had learned about her father's legacy. As they moved into the second vault chamber, she caught sight of a wall-mounted archive, the kind used to store optical drives and encrypted tapes. That was odd. Everything else had been digitized years ago. Why were they holding on to old data in such a sensitive location? She made a mental note, careful not to linger too long. The colonel gestured to the final section, but before she stepped forward, a distinct sound broke the sterile quiet, a soft, mechanical whirring, surveillance cameras. One had just pivoted in her direction. It wasn't just motion sensing. Someone was actively watching. Evelyn let that awareness settle into her bones. She was being monitored far beyond protocol now. The message was clear. You're walking into fire. But she wasn't alone. She had quietly begun building an alliance of sorts, small but significant. 2 junior logisticians in her unit who had noticed similar discrepancies, and an off-site cyber analyst she'd trained with back in Texas who owed her a favor. They had already begun digging, quietly routing backup files, archiving copies, securing logs. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, a custom vibration pattern they had agreed on, confirmation that one of the drives had been cloned. She didn't flinch. Instead, she followed Stratham through the last sealed door and into the coldest part of the vault. Inside, racks upon racks of sealed transport cases were lined with military precision. Most bore standard labels, but a few didn't. A few were marked in codes that hadn't been used officially in decades. Evelyn could feel her pulse behind her ears. These weren't supposed to be here. They were supposed to have been decommissioned or destroyed. This wasn't just about misuse of assets or rerouted shipments. This was about active concealment of weapons, of data, of history. And perhaps worst of all, the colonel was standing in the middle of it, as though it were just another Tuesday. When he turned to speak, it was with that same authoritative calm, but this time, Evelyn heard the crack behind the words, not in tone, but in meaning. He knew she was getting too close. She had to decide in that moment whether to back off or dig deeper. The choice she made would define everything that followed, and she knew there was no going back. Not now, not with what she had seen, not with what she was about to expose. The next morning, the sun had barely crested over the arid hills surrounding Fort Arlstone when Lyra stepped onto the tarmac. The chill of the early desert wind brushed across her face, mingling with the weight of everything she now carried inside. Her encounter with Colonel Marchand the day before hadn't left her mind. The way he froze at the sight of her badge, the haunted recognition in his eyes, and the cryptic response he gave had done more than unnerve her. It had opened a door she didn't even know existed. And now that it was open, it was impossible not to look inside. But instead of retreating, she moved forward, driven not just by curiosity, but by a deepening sense that something far bigger was unfolding. At the edge of the airstrip, the Armory bay doors were already groaning open. She entered briskly, clipboard in hand, but before she even had time to greet the morning crew, a young lieutenant approached her and handed her a folded note. It was creased and unmarked, just her name on the outside. Lyra Quinn. The handwriting was unmistakably old school. Black ink, angular strokes. Inside, only one line. Meet me by the North Side Motor Pool at 1800. Come alone. M. Her heart pounded. M. It had to be Marchand. She slipped the note into her pocket and kept her composure through the morning's routines, managing gear signouts, double-checking manifest entries, assisting with intake reports from an inbound convoy. Hege. But her thoughts never strayed far from the letter. Why would the colonel, a man who operated with military precision and rarely addressed anyone below major in anything but formal briefings, request a private meeting with her, especially after the awkwardness of their previous exchange? As 1800 approached, her anxiety simmered beneath the surface. The North Side Motor Pool was a section of the base rarely used except for low-priority maintenance. Fewer eyes, less foot traffic. It was a strange place for a meeting, but perhaps that was the point. By the time she arrived, the golden light of sunset had poured across the compound, stretching long shadows over the gravel paths and casting a surreal glow on the perimeter fencing. Marchand stood by an old Humvee, arms folded, his face grave and unreadable. Without a word, he motioned for her to follow, leading her behind the chain-link barrier into a small utility shed nestled in the side yard, one that hadn't been used for anything official in years. Inside, it was dim and dusty, a single bulb flickering overhead. He waited until the door shut behind them. "Lieutenant Quinn," he started, voice low and heavy with caution, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." She nodded silently, her throat dry. "Where did you get that badge?" She reached into her pocket and pulled it out slowly, setting it on the old workbench between them. The etched bronze insignia gleamed faintly. "My father," she said. "It was his, Captain Elias Quinn. He served in Desert Reach, Kunar Province, 1998. He never came back." Marchand didn't react immediately. He stared at the badge for what felt like a full minute. Then, with a long breath, he sat on an overturned crate and pressed a hand to his face. "Elias Quinn was my squad leader," he finally said, voice breaking just slightly. "He didn't just serve with me, he saved my life. And that badge, I was there when he died. I thought it was lost in the rubble." Lyra's heart dropped. Her father, the one she barely remembered, the one her mother never spoke of. He wasn't just a name on the memorial wall. He was someone this man had bled beside. She had so many questions, but Marchand was already pulling a weathered folder from his coat pocket. "There's something else," he said, opening it to reveal yellowing pages, photos, and tactical maps. "Your father wasn't just a good soldier. He was investigating something. An internal weapons laundering ring. He stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see." Lyra leaned forward, scanning the documents. Some were redacted, others scribbled in her father's handwriting, short notes, strange codes, and GPS coordinates. Her skin prickled as she realized this wasn't just some forgotten mission report, it was a trail. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked. Marchand hesitated, then looked her dead in the eye. "Because ever since you stepped onto this base, strange things have started happening. Surveillance footage corrupted. Paper trails vanished. Someone's covering their tracks again. I thought this chapter was closed, but I was wrong. You brought it all back, without knowing it." The air in the shed felt thick with unspoken implications. Lyra suddenly saw her presence at Fort Arlstone in a new light, not a mere administrative placement, but a thread someone had hoped would remain buried. And now it was unraveling. Marchand stood and gathered the papers. "I'm trusting you because you've got your father's instincts, but this is dangerous. The same people who buried this 2 decades ago, some of them are still in uniform." He handed her a USB drive and nodded toward the door. "Read the files, decide for yourself. But if you dig further, you'd better be ready. Once you know the truth, there's no turning back." That night, Lyra lay awake in her quarters, the USB drive clutched in her hand. Her world had tilted, and the solid ground beneath her feet had become uncertain. She had come to Fort Arlstone to serve, to follow orders, to continue the legacy of a father she never knew. But now that legacy was whispering to her from the past, warning her, guiding her. And she was no longer sure if she was just here to do her job, or to finish something her father had started before it killed him. The next morning, Lena sat alone in the mess hall, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee, the rising curls of vapor doing little to thaw the chill in her bones. Outside, soldiers marched in formation, the cadence of their boots echoing through the air like distant thunder, but inside her, everything felt unnervingly still. Last night had unearthed something in her, some buried ache that now floated dangerously close to the surface. Colonel Halvers had barely looked at her since their conversation, keeping his distance in a way that felt intentional and loaded. She knew she had struck a nerve, but it wasn't out of malice. It was from truth, and truth, she had learned, often held power to disrupt even the most disciplined hearts. She ate in silence, not really tasting anything, while a faint hum of worry buzzed behind her eyes. She kept seeing Halver's expression from the night before, the clenched jaw, the flicker of pain, the wall that had gone up the moment she mentioned her badge. He knew something, or he was connected to something. And if it had anything to do with what was happening at Fort Cambridge, she needed to know. The badge hadn't just stirred old memories, it had shaken something loose, something he didn't want to deal with. But Lena couldn't walk away from this. Not anymore. This was no longer about her transfer papers or her father's legacy. This was about the living truth that was still unfolding, and she was already too deep into it to back out. After breakfast, she made her way across the compound, slipping into the far side of the main administrative building, where the archive office sat. She had only been in there once, and briefly, but she remembered seeing shelves of case files, troop movements, and mission reports that weren't digitally stored. She knew how to navigate records. Thanks to her father's obsessive documentation at home, she had a knack for sorting through the mess and finding what mattered. She waited until the sergeant at the desk stepped out for his break, then slipped behind the counter and started searching. At first, it was just piles of mundane logistics, fuel reports, base maintenance, standard issue documentation. But then, she found a locked cabinet tucked behind a filing drawer labeled Restricted Deployment Reports. It was old, the kind with an actual metal keyhole. Lena scanned the room until she spotted a ring of backup keys hanging behind a panel under the desk. With a quick glance around, and her heart hammering in her chest, she tried key after key until the last one finally clicked the lock open. Inside, manila folders were stacked tight, some with faded red confidential stamps across the front. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sifted through them, eyes scanning names and unit numbers. Then, there it was, an old personnel report on a classified operation in Khost Province, Afghanistan, dated almost 20 years ago. Her father's name, Captain Roderick Hayes, was listed at the top as commanding officer. Lena's breath caught. The mission was listed as a failed extraction. Notes were sparse, and half the document was redacted, but another name was scribbled in the margin, then Lieutenant David Halvers. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a mission her father had led. Halvers had been with him. That changed everything. She quickly tucked the file under her arm and closed the cabinet, relocking it. Just as she stepped out from behind the desk, the sergeant returned. She offered a casual nod, pretending to be looking for supply logs, then slipped out and made her way straight to her barracks, locking the door behind her once inside. She laid the file on the desk, flipping through the pages again, studying every detail, every fragment of a story that had clearly been buried. Her father and Halvers had been in country during an op that had gone sideways, so badly that it had been sealed and restricted. And the badge she carried now, the one from her father's final deployment, must have been tied to that operation. Suddenly, a soft knock sounded at her door. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't move. The knock came again, and then a voice she recognized. Halvers. Calm, low, but serious. "We need to talk, Hayes. Now." Lena opened the door slowly, stepping aside as the colonel entered, his eyes immediately locking on the file on the desk. She didn't try to hide it. He let out a long breath, then closed the door behind him, his whole posture slouched with a heaviness that looked like it had been waiting years to surface. He walked to the desk, ran his fingers across the folder, then turned to her, the silence thick between them. Finally he spoke, voice rough and tired. "I should have told you the moment I saw the badge." Lena didn't respond. She let him have the space, knowing whatever came next would shape everything that followed. Halvers sat down, rubbing the back of his neck, his gaze far away. "Your father was the kind of man soldiers would follow into hell without a question. That mission in Khost, we were tasked with extracting a local informant, someone who had intel that could have turned the tide in the province. But things got complicated. Intel was bad, we walked into an ambush, we lost good men. Your father," he paused, jaw tightening. "He stayed behind to cover our retreat. Ordered me to pull the rest out. I didn't want to, but he was right. I made the call." Lena felt her breath catch. Her father's last act had been one of sacrifice, but also one of unshakable leadership. Halvers stood, turning away for a moment before speaking again. "The Army sealed that file to protect what was left of the unit's reputation, but I never forgave myself. When I saw your badge, I saw his initials etched into the back. He always did that, marked his gear. I knew it was his, and seeing you with it." He trailed off, then looked her straight in the eyes. "You deserve to know the full story, all of it, even the parts that still hurt." Lena's chest ached. This was more than closure. This was the bridge between what her father had lived for and what she was still trying to become. She nodded, not to forgive, not yet, but to open the door to the truth. The silence that had once sat heavy between them was now replaced with something else. Understanding. And a storm was coming. The evening skies above Kirtland began to soften into streaks of burnt orange and dusky violet, the air cooling with a desert crispness that hinted at the passing of another long day. Inside the secluded training facility tucked on the northeast side of the base, where security badges carried weight far beyond clearance codes, Audra sat at the back of the dimly lit room, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. Colonel Marston had disappeared into a side room with Commander Reyes, leaving behind a silence so sharp it nearly hummed. The 24 elite candidates seated in rows remained still, their backs straight as if any shift in posture might undo the rigid decorum demanded of them. No one whispered. No one dared speculate out loud. But every mind in the room echoed the same question. What in the world was Audra Ward doing here? 10 feet away, Master Sergeant Olivia Brandt sat stiffer than usual, her jaw visibly clenched. Brandt had served on 3 foreign tours, was the first woman to lead logistics in Afghanistan's eastern corridors, and had a reputation for sniffing out any form of manipulation or infiltration. She had been skeptical of Audra from day one, particularly after her badge flashed the emblem of a unit most believed had been decommissioned 5 years earlier, the Obsidian Directive. Audra could feel Brandt's gaze drilling into her, as if her eyes might peel back the layers of whatever secrets Audra carried in her bones. When Colonel Marston returned, the air thickened. He walked with a deliberate slowness that suggested he had just come to a decision far heavier than any he'd made this month, or perhaps this decade. He stood at the front of the room, gripping a folder marked with a single red stamp, classified, eyes only. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the full weight of every mission, loss, and compromise he had ever endured. He introduced Audra as the operational analyst assigned to them by the Defense Strategic Recon Authority, tasked with vetting the psychological readiness and moral thresholds of the candidates, especially after what had happened in the 4th Regiment last year. The moment he said it, a collective tension rippled through the room like a tremor. That incident was never spoken of openly. It involved an elite unit going rogue during a covert mission in Balochistan, resulting in unapproved engagement, a cover-up, and, ultimately, the quiet discharge of 5 decorated officers. No one knew who had flipped, no one had been convicted, but everyone knew the military had begun embedding silent observers since then. What they hadn't expected was that one of them would be a 29-year-old woman with a psychology degree and an untraceable record of field assignments. Audra didn't flinch as the eyes around the room turned toward her. She didn't need to. This was part of the plan. Her presence was never about blending in. It was about being the friction that revealed character, pressure testing the uncrackable. And right now, the pressure was mounting, especially from Brandt, who stood without permission and demanded clarification. "Sir," Brandt said, "with all due respect, operational analysts don't sit in with us unless something's already gone wrong." The room held its breath. Marston simply met her gaze, then looked at Audra. She understood. It was her cue. Audra stood, set down her coffee, and stepped to the front of the room. She spoke evenly, without arrogance or apology. "The reason I'm here is not because of what's gone wrong. It's because of what still could." She let the silence settle. "You're not just training for deployment. You're being watched for thresholds, the moment when duty and instinct collide, and someone's decision becomes irreversible. I've been sent to find those moments before they happen, not after." A murmur broke across the room, not loud, but unmistakable. Some felt insulted, others wary, and a few, Brandt included, furious. But beneath the outrage was a darker realization. None of them had any idea how long she had been watching already. Outside, night settled over the base, floodlights casting shadows across the tarmac. Somewhere beyond the runway, a cargo plane's engines roared to life. But inside, Audra knew the real ignition had just sparked. The truth was, she wasn't just there to watch. She was there to intervene, if necessary. Because someone in that room had a connection to the failed Balochistan operation and a buried link to a classified network that was still operational under the radar. Someone who had once been given a second chance. Someone who might be planning to use it. And now, with the mission accelerating and the units slated to deploy in less than a week for their final trial in Redstone Canyon, Audra knew the window was closing. Brandt wasn't just suspicious, she was onto something. And if she pushed too hard too soon, it might cost them all. But if she held back, the consequences could echo far beyond one broken regiment. This wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about exposure. And for the first time since arriving, Audra felt something cold twist in her chest. This time, she might not be the one in control. The sun blazed overhead as Alina trudged down the gravel path, boots caked in dry dust, her field notebook tightly secured in her back pocket. It had been 4 days since the briefing with Colonel Halstead, and since then, her life had shifted into a rhythm of preparation, reflection, and subtle anxiety. Every minute outside of duty was spent decoding her grandfather's diary, now a central focus of her journey. And yet, despite the revelations about his role in Operation Midnight Anchor and the cryptic warning from the colonel, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that she was still only scratching the surface. The name Elena had been scribbled twice in the back of her grandfather's journal. No surname, no rank, just a first name underlined in faded ink. Each time she stared at it, a new question bloomed. Who was she? Was she a spy? A partner? A threat? The colonel had refused to elaborate, saying only that Elena had been, quote, an anomaly in a war of order, whatever that meant. So she sought out those who had served with her grandfather, digging through records, sitting down with veterans, even revisiting the archives of the base library late into the night. Piece by piece, the story she was reconstructing became increasingly tangled. The official files told of her grandfather as a logistics officer turned field coordinator, but never mentioned the specialized task force he reportedly led in Montenegro. Nor did they contain anything about Elena or the operation involving high-value intelligence extractions. According to the records, the man had simply retired in silence and died an old soldier. That version was now shattered. In between these relentless efforts, Alina was still expected to function in her daily duties. She coordinated armory inspections, oversaw inventory logs, and ensured the base's equipment audit stayed on schedule. The irony was not lost on her. She was surrounded by weapons and defense systems, yet the most critical battle she was fighting was for knowledge. Her quiet persistence hadn't gone unnoticed. Sergeant Vega, a friend and peer, began to cover for her discreetly when she ducked out to make research calls or conduct interviews. It wasn't long before others in the unit began murmuring about her obsession with the past. But Alina didn't care. She had come to the military not just to serve, but to understand. And now, the weight of her family's hidden legacy had settled squarely on her shoulders. The more she uncovered, the more the silence of her grandfather's generation gnawed at her. Why had he never spoken of any of this? Had it been guilt, shame, or something deeper? One evening, as she sat alone in the barracks, the yellow light of her reading lamp illuminating a new set of declassified documents, a name jumped out at her: Elena Voss. Her breath caught. The name was connected to a report titled Directive Shadowlight, dated 1983. The report detailed a covert mission to exfiltrate compromised U.S. operatives from hostile territory in Eastern Europe. A woman named Elena Voss had been instrumental in orchestrating that mission, not from the outside, but as a double agent embedded in the Soviet intelligence network. Her identity had been scrubbed from all public military records, labeled compartmentalized asset, in bold red ink. This woman, if it was indeed the same Elena, had been part of something massive, something that had remained sealed and buried for decades. The implications were staggering. If her grandfather had worked with Elena Voss, then it meant he hadn't just been part of an elite team. He had operated in tandem with one of the most dangerous, valuable assets the Cold War had ever seen. And yet, nobody spoke her name. Why? Alina's thoughts were interrupted by a message pinging on her encrypted tablet. It was from Colonel Halstead. Short, direct. Report to my office. Now. Heart pounding, she threw on her jacket and hurried across the compound. The colonel's office was dim when she entered, the only light coming from a desk lamp, and the glow of the base's perimeter lights through the slatted windows. He didn't speak at first. He merely handed her a sealed envelope. She opened it carefully. Inside were 4 black and white surveillance photos, all from the 1980s, all showing her grandfather and a woman whose sharp features and piercing eyes practically leapt off the page. Elena. Alive. Operating in the field. One photo even showed them embracing, not romantically, but urgently, like comrades in chaos. Alina looked up, searching the colonel's face for explanation. "You need to stop digging," he said at last. "You've gone further than I ever intended you to." But Alina couldn't stop now. She was no longer just chasing shadows. She was on the brink of something real, something transformative. The colonel, seeing the fire in her eyes, sighed and sank into his chair. "If you insist," he muttered, "you'll need clearance. And protection. What you're about to uncover, it didn't just change the course of the Cold War. It redefined the meaning of loyalty." Then he opened a drawer and handed her a laminated keycard, white, embossed with a strange insignia. Her grandfather's name was printed on it, but underneath that, in a smaller font, was another label, Legacy Chain Access, Tier 1. Her hands trembled as she took it. This wasn't a door opening, it was a gate being unlatched, and beyond it, she knew, the real story was waiting. For the first time since she had stepped into Fort Brannigan, Liana found herself without a clear path forward. The victory at Arlen's perimeter had come at a great personal cost, not just physically but emotionally. The confrontation with Colonel Merrick had fractured something between them. Though he had eventually given his silent approval for her leadership during the operation, his cold withdrawal in the aftermath sent a wave of confusion and doubt through her. His silence spoke louder than any reprimand ever could, and it haunted her every step as she walked the length of the tarmac in the days that followed, the weight of unspoken words growing heavier with each passing hour. Liana threw herself back into work, trying to make sense of scattered logistics reports, reorganizing the triage center she'd built with her team, and writing evaluations for the new recruits. Her name was now spoken with reverence among many of the younger soldiers. Even the older officers, once skeptical, now gave her subtle nods of respect when passing in the corridor. She was no longer just the young armorer with a clipboard. She was Lieutenant Ramirez, the woman who had led a crucial defensive stand and saved more than just supplies that night. And yet, she couldn't celebrate that growth. Not fully. Not while the man who had once been her harshest critic and, strangely, her quietest supporter, now barely met her eyes. They hadn't spoken since the field report debrief, where Merrick had merely signed her transcript without a single comment. That paper, now filed and forgotten by the administration, was burned into her memory like a scar. She began arriving earlier and staying later, trying to run into him by accident, hoping for a moment that might spark the conversation neither of them seemed brave enough to start. But Merrick, ever the tactician, moved like a shadow, somehow always missing her by minutes. She even returned to the armory floor several times, under the guise of checking on shipments or mentoring the quartermasters, thinking perhaps that the familiarity of the setting might allow for some bridge to be rebuilt. But he wasn't there. He hadn't set foot inside since the incident, delegating oversight to another captain. The air between them had gone from tension to silence, and that silence was deafening. The rest of the base moved forward. Promotions were handed out. Medals were awarded. Liana was formally recognized in a ceremony that she found hollow without his presence. Her father, retired Major Tomas Ramirez, had flown in for the event. He gave her a proud salute and a quiet word about how proud her late mother would have been, but even his warm eyes couldn't pierce the chill that Merrick's absence created. She stood at the podium, medal pinned to her chest, wondering if it all mattered without the closure she sought. She felt like she was marching forward while dragging a ghost behind her. Then came the unexpected invitation, a base-wide strategy summit hosted by the senior brass, a multi-day intensive meant to evaluate the future of Fort Brannigan's command structure and integrate new perspectives from officers rising in the ranks. Liana's name was included on the first page of the call sheet. At first, she assumed it was a formality, another token inclusion to appease the growing voices advocating for more female leadership. But as she read further, she saw that her name was not just on the list, she was scheduled to present. Her topic? Adaptive command under crisis pressure. The summary? A case study. Ramirez at Arlen. Her hands shook slightly as she held the paper. This wasn't just a lecture, this was a spotlight, a test, and a message. The request came with a note from General Hanley himself, suggesting that Colonel Merrick had put forth her name personally. She read that line over and over again, trying to absorb what it meant. He had recommended her. Despite his silence, despite his distance, something stirred in her chest, a tightness giving way to a cautious warmth. She spent days preparing, poring over field maps, decision logs, communications records, anything to ensure her account was bulletproof. If Merrick had extended this hand, she would meet it not with trembling, but with strength. The day of the summit arrived, and Fort Brannigan's command center buzzed with formality and tension. Officers from across the state bases were seated in ascending rows, their uniforms crisp, their gazes sharp. Liana took the stage with a calm she didn't feel. She scanned the room once, and there he was. Colonel Merrick, seated at the edge of the front row, arms folded, expression unreadable. But he was there. Not as an obstacle. As a witness. She spoke. Not just of strategy or tactical pivots, but of fear, of grit, of humanity. She told them about the weight of making decisions when lives were measured in seconds, of trusting instinct shaped not just by rank, but by experience. She even spoke of the moment when she had doubted herself the most, and how silence from a superior could echo louder than a battle. The room didn't stir, but she felt the pulse of its attention shift. When she finished, the applause was restrained, respectful. But Merrick stood. He didn't clap. He simply nodded. Once. And for Liana, that single nod carried more validation than any medal ever could. Even as the storm of the day's revelations swirled around her, Eden found a stillness within herself that she hadn't known before. The events of the last few days had stripped her bare, exposed her past, challenged her sense of belonging, and tested her courage in ways no battlefield ever had. But now, seated quietly in the corner of the officers' lounge with a cooling cup of coffee untouched in her hands, she could feel something new settle in. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was close. It was clarity, the kind that comes only after standing face to face with ghosts and choosing not to run. Colonel Maddox's earlier silence had cracked wide open into a revelation Eden hadn't been prepared for. And yet, in hindsight, she realized a part of her had always been waiting for this reckoning. The woman she once called mother, Captain Margot Alvers, had never truly been gone, not from memory, not from consequence. Her choices, her shame, and her legacy had lived on in Eden's blood, her badge, and the quiet ache that followed her wherever she went. That legacy was no longer hidden, and strangely, the shame no longer held its weight. The base buzzed with restrained curiosity. Rumors, like smoke, slithered through hallways and mess halls, wrapping themselves around whispered conversations and exchanged glances. The colonel had made it clear, Eden's service was not up for discussion, and anyone who treated her differently would answer to him directly. Yet she could feel the shift, the way people paused just a beat too long when she walked by, the way they nodded with a different kind of respect, cautious maybe, but real. Sergeant Rennick was the only one who acted unchanged, walking into her office without knocking and slamming a dossier on her desk with his usual theatrical flair. Eden looked up with a tired smile as he sat across from her. The folder between them wasn't thick, but the weight it carried felt immense. Inside was the information Maddox had promised to declassify: photographs, transcripts, incident reports. The life her mother had led in the shadowed edges of duty, recorded and stored in government silence. Eden hesitated before flipping the first page, unsure whether she was ready to fully understand the woman who had haunted her nightmares and dreams alike. But she had come too far now to turn away. Each page unfolded a version of Margot Alvers Eden had never been allowed to see. A leader, yes, but also a strategist whose instincts saved more than just lives. They averted crises. She had once been praised in confidential reports as the linchpin in the containment of multiple international threats. But the deeper Eden read, the more cracks appeared. There were patterns, risks taken without approval, lines blurred in the name of necessity, and a final mission where orders had been ignored entirely. That mission had ended not just her career, but the lives of 3 operatives under her command. Eden had spent her whole life believing her mother had walked away. Now she saw the truth. She had been removed, scrubbed from record, and quietly exiled. Her silence hadn't been abandonment, it had been enforced. Her exile wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. By the time she reached the last page, Eden's hands were trembling. She pressed her palms flat on the desk to ground herself, breathing deeply through the nausea that rolled up in her chest. Sergeant Rennick, uncharacteristically quiet, waited patiently before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was low and steady, a counterweight to the emotional chaos in the room. What you do with that, Eden, is entirely up to you. You don't owe anyone an explanation, but if you choose to own it, to carry it as part of who you are, it doesn't have to be a scar. It can be armor. She met his gaze, grateful for the friendship that had never wavered, even when everything else had. He stood and left without another word, giving her the space to decide for herself how the next chapter would begin. Over the next week, Eden found herself in unfamiliar territory, not physically, but emotionally. She wasn't hiding anymore, and the exposure left her vulnerable in ways she couldn't ignore. But rather than shrink from it, she leaned into the discomfort. She resumed her duties with greater intensity, refocusing her energy into the Armory's operations and the logistics tasks that had once given her purpose. Slowly, something remarkable happened. Her team didn't just follow her, they rallied around her. Trust, she realized, wasn't just about competency. It was about truth. And now that hers was no longer buried, people saw her differently. Not as a legacy of failure, but as someone who had endured, survived, and continued to serve despite the weight she carried. Colonel Maddox, too, became a different figure in her life. He remained professional, but there was a warmth now that hadn't existed before. During their meetings, he often asked for her input, invited her insights, and sometimes just sat in thoughtful silence as she spoke. It wasn't favoritism, it was recognition. He knew the battlefield she had walked through, and he respected the warrior she had become on the other side of it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains that flanked the base, he handed her a small black box. Inside was a coin, engraved with the insignia of his command unit and the phrase, "For valor beyond orders." It was a token, yes, but one that held generations of meaning. Eden closed the box and nodded in quiet thanks, understanding that this wasn't just about her mother anymore. This was about who Eden Rain was now, and who she could be. That night, in the quiet of her quarters, she wrote a letter, not for anyone else, but for herself, a letter to the woman who had both broken and birthed her. She wrote about pain, about confusion, but also about pride. And when she finished, she folded it gently and placed it inside her mother's old insignia pouch, the one the colonel had returned to her after unlocking the badge's true story. She didn't know if she would ever need to open it again, but it felt right to place the past where it belonged, not forgotten, but no longer feared. As she turned out the light, Eden realized something she hadn't dared to hope for. She no longer felt like a woman hiding in someone else's story. She was finally living her own. A cold wind swept over the compound as dusk settled in, turning the amber skies above Fort Chapel into a deepening indigo. The tension that had crept into the edges of Camilla's daily routine had now taken center stage, pushing her into a version of herself she was still trying to understand. The whispers around her badge had turned from idle curiosity to something heavier, something more watchful, especially from those with brass on their collars. The colonel's silence that day at the Armory had not been a momentary glitch in his typically rigid demeanor. It had marked a turning point, one that now rippled through the fort like a quiet warning bell. Since then, she'd been reassigned, not demoted or punished outright, but given a position that isolated her more than ever. Camilla now worked in the far west hangar, where inventory and outdated equipment went to be cataloged and forgotten. It was a subtle exile, wrapped in the pretense of administrative support restructuring. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. She wasn't in trouble, But she also wasn't welcome. Still, Camilla had never been one to crumble under pressure. Her entire life had been a series of proving grounds, and this was no different. If anything, the unspoken suspicion surrounding her fueled her resolve to stay, to uncover the truth that had sent Colonel Harwood into silence and turned Fort Chapel into a minefield of veiled glances. She poured herself into her tasks, with a focus so sharp it bordered on obsession. She worked late, cleaned up decades' worth of sloppy files, and unearthed equipment logs that hadn't been touched since the early 90s. And that was when she found it. It was a crate, mislabeled and half-buried behind broken-down compressors and rusted-out lockers. The manifest said it was part of a decommissioned comms array, but when she pried the crate open, what she found didn't match. Inside, tucked beneath moldy canvas, was a locked steel case marked with a code she didn't recognize but had seen before on her badge. Her heart beat faster. The insignia was unmistakable, and it wasn't standard Army issue. She ran her hand across the case, brushing away dust and debris, and saw the letters DVL9 engraved faintly on one corner. That code again. The same code from the internal personnel directory that listed her father's name. The same one found on the archived clearance paper that bore her name even before she had joined the military. It was no coincidence. She took a photo of the code and closed the crate carefully, restoring the old canvas over the contents. She knew she couldn't take the case, not without triggering suspicion, but she could go back later. She had to know what was inside. That night, she barely slept. Every possible scenario spun through her mind. Was her father part of a classified program? Was the badge a legacy pass? Did it give her access to something they weren't supposed to know still existed? And if so, who else knew? Who was keeping it secret? And why? By morning, her decision was clear. She needed help, but not from anyone on base. She took a chance and reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to since graduation. Eli Marquez, a systems analyst who'd once hacked a simulated NSA firewall during their capstone project. He was brilliant, reckless, and owed her a favor. They met in a quiet cafe 2 towns over, under the guise of a casual reunion. Camilla showed him the photo of the steel case and the DVL9 tag. Eli's smile faded instantly. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's not just any clearance code," he said. DVL9 was part of a ghost program, something rumored to exist during the Cold War that linked biochemical research with military intelligence and personnel tracking. Some thought it was an urban legend. Others believed it tied into Project Sylph, a supposedly defunct government experiment that blurred the lines between human enhancement and surveillance. Camilla felt the air thicken. If what Eli said was true, and that badge had something to do with Sylph or DVL9, then her very presence at Fort Chapel wasn't a coincidence. It was a trigger. Eli offered to run the code through encrypted black net channels he had access to, promising results within 48 hours. Camilla returned to the base that evening, pretending nothing had changed, but her mind buzzed with anticipation. She was playing a dangerous game now, one that could unravel everything or expose something that had been buried for decades. But she was done being a pawn in someone else's agenda. That night, she snuck back into the west hangar. She waited until the patrol cycle passed, then slipped through the shadows to the hidden crate. With her gloves on and flashlight low, she retrieved the steel case and tucked it into her backpack, replacing it with weights to mimic the original load. No alarms triggered. No sounds. Only the steady echo of her own breath in the cavernous dark. When she returned to her quarters, she locked the door, pulled the curtains, and placed the case on her desk. She didn't try to open it yet. She wanted Eli's data first. But just knowing it was there, within arm's reach, sent chills down her spine. There was something inside that case that tied her past to the present, something the military wanted to stay buried. And somehow, she had been chosen to stand at the edge of that secret, whether by accident or design. The next day, she received an encrypted message from Eli. It read, "Cam, whatever you do, don't open it yet. I found something. We need to talk. In person. Urgent." That was all. No details, no hint of what he'd uncovered. Just urgency. Camilla stared at the message, then at the steel case on her desk. Every instinct in her body screamed to open it. But something in Eli's words made her pause. For the first time, she felt truly afraid, not just of what she might discover, but of what forces might already be watching. By the time the early dawn began stretching across the skies above Fort Hartley, the quiet hum of the base was already alive with preparation. But inside the restricted east wing of the command compound, the mood was far from routine. Everyone walking those corridors sensed the gravity in the air, an unspoken ripple that spread ever since Colonel Guerin's uncharacteristic silence the night before. Ava hadn't slept, not truly. She had spent the night sorting through everything: her badge, the letter from her father, the contents of that classified file Guerin had reluctantly given her, and every odd glance that had been cast her way since her assignment began. Something monumental was unfolding, and she wasn't sure whether she was at the center of it, or merely its trigger. Guerin was already seated in the conference room when Ava arrived. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from fatigue but from something deeper. Regret? Guilt? Anticipation? She couldn't tell. Two military officials in plain clothes were already in the room with him. One was Commander Elric, the other a civilian intelligence officer named Mathis Harrow, whose presence alone confirmed this wasn't standard military business. As Ava took her seat, the folder in her hand trembled slightly. Guerin motioned for her to set it down. "No more documents," he said in a voice that carried the weight of a decision already made. "Now we talk." The civilian, Mathis, leaned forward first. "You've activated a ripple that's been dormant for 2 decades, Ava. What you uncovered in your father's records is tied to a program so deeply classified that even Guerin here wasn't fully briefed until last night." Ava's breath hitched, but she steadied herself. She wasn't here for vague warnings. She wanted answers. She deserved them. Mathis continued, "Your father wasn't just a logistics specialist. He was part of a covert detachment assigned to monitor psychological anomalies in soldiers stationed near what we once called Project Skyvale, a failed experimentation initiative under DARPA's direction." The room fell into a loaded silence as the words sank in. Skyvale. Ava had read the name once on a scribbled note in her father's journal but had no idea what it meant. Guerin finally spoke. "Your badge was issued to one of the researchers who worked on that program. Your father swapped it out when the project was dismantled. We don't know why. Maybe to protect someone. Maybe to protect you." His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, all his authority melted into something closer to humanity. "We only know one thing. That badge contains biometric keys embedded with old command strings that, once scanned into our system, triggered a dormant alert." Ava's head swirled. "So what happens now?" Commander Elric, who had been silent until then, finally rose and pulled out a thick binder, slamming it down on the table. "This isn't about past mistakes anymore. The protocol your badge activated was tied to a contingency plan, one involving a facility hidden underneath the very ground we walk on." He paused. "It's not just a weapons archive. It's a containment unit for something non-conventional." Ava's heart raced. Non-conventional was a term they only used when the military was talking about threats they couldn't categorize, things beyond enemy lines, beyond reason, beyond even science. Her voice cracked slightly when she asked, "What's in it?" Mathis responded without looking up. "We don't know. No one's opened it in 23 years. But now, because of your badge, the system thinks it's time." The magnitude of what they were suggesting made Ava dizzy. She had come here to deliver equipment, to continue her service, to prove herself on merit and diligence. Now she was being drawn into something that had begun long before she ever donned a uniform. They led her down a private elevator that descended deeper than any she'd used before on base. Below the known infrastructure, below the munitions archive, even below the emergency shelters, was a final steel chamber, rusted on the edges but humming faintly with power. Garen handed it to her with a look that was neither approval nor encouragement. It was more like resignation. The scan beeped once, then again. A green light pulsed on the panel, and the door unsealed with a hiss of old pressure. A forgotten breath of the past exhaled into the present. Inside was not what anyone expected. No strange device, no monstrous entity, no weapons of war. Instead, in the middle of the chamber sat a single sealed container, roughly the size of a suitcase, marked only with an insignia Ava had seen once before. On the back of a photograph, her father kept hidden in the lining of an old jacket. She stepped toward it slowly, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the biometric lock. Garen stopped her. "Are you sure you want to know what's inside?" Ava stared at the case. The weight of all the years, the classified whispers, the silence of her father's death, all of it now pointed to this moment. "I have to," she said simply, not as a soldier, but as a daughter. As the case hissed open, the room held its breath. What Ava found inside would not only shift her understanding of her father's legacy, but would alter the direction of the entire base, and perhaps the country's defense program forever. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the base's small chapel, casting long golden slats across the polished wood floor where Cadence sat alone in the front pew. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap, the official orders resting beside her like a fragile truth etched in ink and command. She had not worn her uniform today. Instead, she sat in a simple white blouse and jeans, her hair loose, as though stripping away all markers of rank or duty would bring her closer to understanding everything that had just happened. The past weeks felt like a film reel spinning too fast to comprehend. Her reassignment, the quiet commendation from Colonel Heron, the subtle yet unmistakable thaw in the command's attitude toward her, and the deeply personal letter she received from General McConnell himself, acknowledging the truth she had uncovered and the institutional silence she had broken. Across the chapel's stained glass windows were scenes of courage and sacrifice, soldiers helping villagers, medics treating the wounded under fire, comrades carrying each other through war-torn fields. She looked at those scenes now not as symbolic tributes, but as mirrors of the burden she had carried for years without even fully realizing it. She wasn't just one woman in uniform anymore. She had become a quiet storm that forced a reckoning, not out of anger, but out of a desire to protect the next generation of soldiers like her, who would walk those same halls and corridors. And yet, even after the reverberations of her badge's story had reshaped policies and prompted leadership inquiries, the ache of what she had endured, the loneliness, the struggle, the loss, remained buried just beneath the surface, like unhealed scar tissue. Cadence heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, and didn't need to turn to know it was Heron. He sat beside her without a word, his presence respectful and quiet. In his hands, he held the medallion she had received days ago, the Service Valor Recognition, an honor rarely given for non-combat action. It was heavy and bronze, engraved with words that tried to capture the intangible weight of integrity. He handed it to her without ceremony, and for a moment both simply stared at it, as if unsure whether it was a symbol of victory or an apology long overdue. Colonel Heron's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse with something deeper than fatigue. He confessed that he had gone through her old reports again, this time not as a superior officer scanning for protocol errors, but as a man trying to understand the fault lines in his own silence. He had seen, too late, what Cadence had seen years ago, that beneath every official report lay the stories no one wanted to read, the inconvenient truths that disrupted reputations and threatened career trajectories. And yet, by facing them head-on, she hadn't just salvaged her dignity, she had reshaped the expectations of an entire command structure. There was no formal apology in his words, but there was something deeper, the raw recognition of failure. He admitted he had looked the other way, not out of cruelty, but out of weakness, convinced that some problems were better left buried. But Cadence, young and unrelenting, had proven otherwise. She had shown that courage was not just found in battlefields, but in filing that one last report, standing firm in that one difficult briefing, walking back into the same office that dismissed her, badge shining with quiet defiance. As he sat beside her now, Heron's silence was no longer one of denial, but of reverence. Cadence took the medal, but she didn't pin it to her chest. Not yet. It would go into her keepsake box, beside the original badge that started everything, still slightly scratched, still glinting in the light, as if holding the story of all it had seen. That badge had become more than an identifier. It was a relic, a symbol of resistance, a voice for the unheard. And one day, when another young soldier found themselves questioning the very walls around them, maybe they would hear her story and find the courage to push forward too. Later that day, she stood outside her new assignment post, the modest sign reading, Officer Cadence Arlow, Strategic Policy Review. It wasn't a flashy title, but it gave her the platform she had long hoped for, to ensure oversight, to write the reports that mattered, to train commanding officers on human dignity, and to become the advocate she herself never had. The first cadet assigned to shadow her walked in nervously, unsure of what to expect from the woman whose name had become a quiet legend in the force. Cadence greeted her with a smile, invited her to sit, and pulled out her first case review. Not a cautionary tale, but a story of persistence, grit, and the strength of one badge that made a colonel fall silent. As evening fell over the base and the American flag was lowered, Cadence stood, watching it flutter in the wind. She thought of the friends she had lost, the nights she cried alone, the doubts that once ate away at her. But now there was something else. Not pride, exactly. More like peace. She had stood her ground in a place where most would fold, and from that defiance had come change, however imperfect. Somewhere in that vast system, a door had opened, and she had been the one to turn the key. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.